FEQ is a new style of event.
What's different about this event, it's not conventional really. It's not about workshops and stands and stall holders. It is that, but it's also a chance for us to have two panels.
We have a Q&A panel in the style of BBC Question Time, and then we also have networking and exhibiting opportunities.
We want to hear what the sector actually thinks about apprenticeships, so we want to give people an opportunity to actually ask questions and get answers from experts in the sector.
We wanted to get involved. We've been working with Bolt anyway on some outreach stuff with FE Spotlights and FE Insights, and it was a great chance for us to work together again.
One of our values is to give back, and we believe that hosting debates like this will generate discussion and lead to improvements in the sector.
I wanted to have an event where it was open to anybody to come and for people to be brave enough to sit on a panel and answer a question that's given to them.
All the questions come from either attendees that have sent them in ahead of time or from the floor itself at the end of each panel.
Today we have two panel sessions. One is on endpoint assessment, one is on apprenticeships, reform and funding. We wanted a broad spectrum of contributors on the panel.
From employers, from awarding bodies, from endpoint assessment organisations, from training providers, to make it a 360 panel of what represents the apprenticeship sector.
And I think we've got a fantastic mix in there.
For the panel chair, we wanted someone well respected and very knowledgeable within apprenticeships, and as the ex-chair of AALP, Stewart was an obvious choice.
He's been around for decades. He will hate me for saying that, but he knows the people, he knows the questions to ask.
An independent, incredibly knowledgeable guy, respected in the industry.
He knows what the issues are in the sector today, so he won't be afraid to ask the questions.
Well, thanks again for those of you who've attended both Discussion 1 and Discussion 2, and for those who you're new to this, welcome to you. And indeed, our esteemed guest, Gordon, who's joining us as well. This discussion is a wide-ranging discussion around apprenticeships, and particularly in terms of the funding. We've got and had a number of questions that have been put to the panel. So thank you for all of those, and I guess this type of event is a bit of a process whereby people are engaged before the event through the questions, but also after the event we'll be publishing some of those responses. So we do see it as a process. That thank you for your input already, and hopefully you'll find the discussion useful. And I think we are a bit of a tipping point in terms of the apprenticeship system, whereby we're in the middle of a number of reforms, and many people would say that we're at the point now where we've got to make it work, because this is as good an opportunity to make apprenticeships what we all believe they should be. Our second panel is made up of a number of people who have got huge experience in the sector, including Kirsty Donnelly from City and Guilds, Catherine Marshall from Lloyds Bank, who manages their apprenticeship programme, Alison May from South Bank University, which obviously the degree apprenticeships is a major issue for us and a major opportunity, and I'm sure we'll be hearing about that. Graham Razey, the Group Principal Chief Executive for East Kent College Group. Mary Sansom, who works for QA, a big provider in the sector, and of course Gordon Marsden, who's here representing the Labour Party as the main opposition party, but also has huge experience of the skills sector. I guess without further ado, we ought to move to the first question, and that's been put by Sue Wright from CMI.
How successful do you think the levy has been, and what do you think should be done to get more employer engagement and starts in apprenticeships?
Kirsty, perhaps I could start with you.
Wow, okay, it's a
Big question, big
big question to start with, and probably I'm going to try and not sit on the fence on this one, but it's difficult not to, because I think my immediate response to that is it is still too early to say. I think we just have to accept we're in this for the long haul, and therefore, although yes, we have got the statistics that talk to the year-on-year decline against the old frameworks versus the new standards, I think we are starting to see some green shoots starting around the new standards, the number of new standards that are available. Hopefully you're going to hear from this panel this evening, not least the employers represented on it, about some of the really good things that are coming out of the apprenticeship system right now. But it is clear that there are things that we still haven't got right, and there are clearly things that still need to happen. I mean, this constant sort of meddling and tinkering with policy and funding, yet at the same time, if we hadn't had the recent change that's just been announced around the fact that now apprentices don't have to be employed at the end of the apprenticeship, you might argue that's a good tinkering, as long as it doesn't mean that what this actually leads to is lots of apprentices on sort of second-rate work experience and don't get a really good apprenticeship programme. But I think what's really great about the opportunity we've got as a sector, as an ecosystem, is to put that quality into those apprenticeship programmes. So as long as we make sure that quality's there, as long as the quality's there in the on-programme and in the all-important EPA, the endpoint assessment that you will have heard Stewart and the panel were talking about earlier, then I think we've got to remain optimistic that whilst the system, we can't say the system is fully working right now, we just simply can't, we have to actually stick with it and make it work, because how else are we actually going to address the continuing looming skill shortages that we've got, not let alone with Brexit round the corner. So something had to change. We couldn't stay with what we had. That is a fact. Whether we've got it absolutely right, whether the government's got it right now, no. But I think we have to be optimistic about all the hard work and the momentum that has been created. Clearly, when you look at the stats around how much the levy is actually being used, there is still a long way to go. I mean, we've got things like 1.8 billion in the levy pot, and when I last looked, there was something like 110 million that had only been drawn down. I think that's going up. I think that's now finally going up. So as I say, I think we're starting to see those green shoots come through. But that would be my opening statement on that.
So general support for the concept of the levy, but clearly way to go. Catherine, in terms of employers, what's your view of the levy? You're paying it, so...
Yeah, no, absolutely. So from our perspective, the levy and the reforms has been very positive. It has proved a catalyst to enable us to talk to our senior leaders about apprenticeships and really get the buy-in from the top down in order for us to deliver what we want to deliver. And indeed, we've seen a significant opportunity with a number of standards and the opportunity for us to diversify. So I think at the start of last year, we had about 10 different programmes that we were offering across Lloyds Banking Group. We've now got over 35 different programmes. So there really is something for everyone across the whole group. So for us, it has been a positive thing.
Gordon, I know this was something that, in some respects, both parties had talked about in the past. What's your view of where we're up to?
Yes, well, I'll try and be as charitable as I can. You're absolutely right. We were supportive, and we are still supportive of the principle of the levy. But I have to say, it's had a pretty ropey existence so far. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm picking up on what Kirsty said. We are in for the long haul, and we need to look at the long haul. But, you know, when you introduce something like this, you've really got to get message and process and things as right as you possibly can first time round. And I think the government, frankly, were pretty abysmal in that respect. And that's why we are seeing the long drag that we are seeing with the statistics at the moment. And, you know, it comes back to the old question of what is the apprenticeship levy for? And there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, and there are also surveys. But the truth of the matter is that a number of these surveys are still showing that a significant number of employers, not necessarily the biggest employers, but certainly a lot of medium-sized employers and providers, and that still have grave doubts about the way in which this is working. Why have they got those doubts? Basically, because so much of it is being impacted by the slowness of movement from frameworks to standards, not helping at all. It's also about a certain amount of cynicism in some areas as to what this is. I've had over the last 12 months numbers of conversations with employers, and they're enormous, and people have said, yes, we're very committed to this, and other people have said, frankly, the way it's been handled, we just regard it as another payroll tax, and we're trying to get stuff out of it. Now, on the back of that, of course, we have the pretty grim starts statistics. Government has kept saying, well, you've got to expect this because people all piled in for apprenticeship applications before the levy came in, and this, that, and the other. But that tail, that drag tail, is going on too long, and so you're also getting people saying, well, we've got big companies. I mean, you mentioned Lloyd's. Lloyd's obviously, from what you've said, Catherine, are doing well. And we can always, I think in this sector, as in other sectors, we can always point to individual companies who are doing well with a particular thing. The key issue is, how are we doing across the board? And across the board, we ain't doing too well. 2 or 3 positive things that I think we should say, and what we would say, and what we've tried to say to the government. First of all, the concept of overtraining apprenticeships, which is actually one that I spoke about 5 years ago at a Training 2000 event. I still believe that if there were financial and other incentives for larger employers to overtrain and place in the supply chain, that would soak up some of this money. I think the government's got to be much more imaginative about looking at the possibilities for devolved administrations to be able to make use of the levy, and obviously Sadiq Khan has been talking about that as well. And I think we also need to look at whether in fact it's reasonable, certainly in the short term, for people who are not being able to use, for whatever reason, their apprenticeship levy, to be able to use it for other forms of skills training. I wouldn't want to see that as a long-term thing, because I think it would undercut the principle of it. And the other point, of course, which we continue to make, is that in the context of the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, as it is still, although it's not kicked in on the TE's technical education side, there is still a lack of resources to take this process forward.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think most people would agree with you that there's no doubt, whether we like it or not, the number of starts is low, and therefore that's, for every one of those is an apprentice who's not getting their training. So I think we'd all agree. Graham, any views on the system as a whole?
Well, I think just putting all the challenges of the implementation to one side, I think from a provider perspective, it has enabled us to have a new conversation with some of the bigger employers in our area. We're very much rooted to a single locality. So we have been able to have a conversation with some of our bigger employers that unfortunately wasn't there previously. So I think the levy has sparked maybe an interest, not necessarily always action, but I think it's sparked an interest that's enabled us just to have a dialogue about what they can do with their levy. And Gordon's absolutely right. Some of them are just saying, well, it's another tax and that's okay and we'll live with that. But actually others have been willing to engage in a dialogue, and we've managed to work with them to actually have some positive starts. I get a little bit annoyed about the volume issue. We may come on to that a bit later, but I want to see quality of starts, not quantity. And I'm quite pleased that I know it's convenient for the government to drop the 3 million target, but I think actually broadly I'm pleased about that, because I actually want quality placements for our young people and our adult retrainers, and I want apprenticeships to absolutely mean something that actually when you achieve it, actually it's worthwhile. So I take the point about, well, that's a number not getting in apprenticeships, but actually for me, in my region, I want them to be all of the highest quality.
I guess we'd all agree, and there is a bit of a dichotomy. It shouldn't be, because every single apprentice should be of the highest quality, and if the controls aren't there to make sure that's the case. And I accept the dichotomy of having a volume target. I'm not sure the government's dropped it yet.
I think they're conveniently
changing the emphasis. But your first point, I think, again, is very important, that the levy does mean that there's a new set of people engaged. And in terms of degree apprenticeships, again, a new level of debate. Have you found that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, There's clearly a correlation between the introduction of the levy and the fact that in the 4 to 7 sector, we've seen a 24% increase. I'm in the area that actually has seen a rise. So you have to correlate those two things. And I think that's only a good thing to see more level 4 plus opportunities. Personally, I think the levy still does have a lot of problems. And I think we can't deny the fact that we've only utilised it at around 8%. That's a huge, humongous chunk of money that we're looking at going back into the Treasury from next year that we should be utilising as businesses, as employers, and most importantly, for our students and apprentices. And I think as a sector, we really do need to galvanise to utilise that.
No, I agree. Right.
Yeah, I would echo what a number of people have said. It's been very slow to start, but momentum is absolutely building. So similarly to Alison, we will operate in a tech space where we've seen growth, quite significant growth in number of starts in the technical space. And the conversations that were alluded to earlier about this kind of, we're going to wipe it out, it's going to go, that was where we were with employers about 18 months, 2 years ago. When in fact, I remember going to an event with employers, our employers that we hosted, and there was that kind of attitude in the room, that there's real frustration from employers around what on earth am I going to spend this on? And it was a race to spend it. I want to spend it now. It wasn't necessarily about how was I going to use it to drive value. And it has taken a long time and a lot of hard work to take employers on that journey. And exactly to the point made earlier, the admin and the processes around that haven't helped. It's actually been, we've been fighting against that with employers and trying to help employers navigate their way through that. But we've done that. And so I think the second part of the question was around, well, what else can be done to encourage employers and starts? Stability. We spoke about it in the previous session, right? You've made all of these phenomenal changes. Some of them, they're not quite worked yet, but we've had to go on a journey. And actually, we can see the green shoots. We can see the signs that this is working. Broad brush change cannot be the answer.
Okay, and the second question, I think, sort of relates to it and something that Gordon alluded to. So, can we go to Nathan Constantino?
So in light of a couple of things we've heard there, 8% use of the current levy pot, which is amazing really when you think about it, how the recent changes in the way funding can be allocated to, and I'll call it the supply chain, affected employers. And most importantly for me as a member of the supply chain, how does the panel feel this can aid the growth of apprenticeship starts?
So just to be clear, what the question is, the 10% of someone's levy pot can be transferred. It's not just the supply chain companies, it's to any other company, whether they're levy payer, non-levy payer. Will that help? Is that something that we should encourage? Gordon, you raised that issue around.
Yes, I mean, any movement in that area is welcome. And I referred to the fact what I'd said about overtraining for the supply chain. But of course, these issues of sector and place come into this. There are some, if I think, for example, in terms of the defence industry, the aerospace industry, which is just down the road from my constituency in Blackpool, if I'm thinking about BAE Systems and their sites at Wharton in Salisbury in Lancashire. Well, there is an established supply chain in that area, so which is very strongly related to BAE's overall objectives. And so it's not too difficult, for BAE, for example, although they've also got their own very strong apprenticeship schemes, to do that sort of thing. I think the more interesting question, or the more challenging question, to get more of that money used, is to what extent, and obviously 10% doesn't, as I say, just have to go to the supply chain, to what extent can large employers who are not being able to utilise their levy, to what extent can they work creatively with other smaller businesses in their geographic area? And this, I think, also, this brings me back to, again, I'm sorry to harp on about the Devo Max issue. If we had, if we were further along, I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. In the ideal world, I do not believe that skills policy, increasingly, that skills policy and apprenticeship policy should be micromanaged in Whitehall, away from the areas where the travel to work issues and where there's the dynamic of a sub-regional economy. I don't want to get too techie, but that's basically my view. Now, we're a long way away from that at the moment, but I think the government has moved at a pretty snail's pace in terms of engaging with the, developing organisations being able to do that, whether we're talking about combined authorities or metro mayors or whatever, and that ability of to have a combination of the impact locally by local decision makers with larger companies and perhaps with medium-sized companies or smaller companies who are maybe in a supply chain or maybe just geographically part of that sub-region, would be a very good and a very dynamic way of taking this process forward.
Okay, thanks. And I tend to agree. I've not met many employers that would want to give the money back to the Treasury. So when I think that dawns on them, and there are options around transferring funds, it might be more obvious to them about what can be done. Just in your conversations with other employers, do you think it will be a more important part of the system to utilise some of the funds?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in Lloyds Banking Group, we're very supportive of it and we want to adopt it. It fits with our strategy of helping Britain prosper and being a responsible business. As yet, we haven't agreed how we will use the 10%, and it has been complicated, absolutely. And I think from talking to a number of other organisations, they're in a similar position to us. The appetite is there, and we also have to be aware of the administrative overhead. So, if we're going out to a number of different organisations, and that impacts on the resource in my team to manage that process. So I think, in terms of pooling resources from a regional perspective, I think that absolutely makes sense, and then you can have more impact in what you are doing.
And I guess this falls into the, I would say this, wouldn't I? My career's been about training providers and getting training providers as an important part of the process. My feel is that until training providers grab it and make it work for employers, it probably won't happen. I just wonder if any of our training providers would have a view about that. Most training providers I talk to say, well, that's not going to be important. We're not going to bother with that. It's too difficult. But I just wonder what your view is.
I think from our perspective, it is quite sectoral. We work a lot with the built environment and construction. So actually for us, this has been on the agenda. But again, it's just been very, very frustrating for employers. They finally then had the capability to transfer the 10%, but then it was only to one employer. Now, for those of you that know the intricacies of subcontracting in construction, that wasn't particularly helpful. So we then waited till where we are now, where it can be multiple employers. But again, the administrative burden of it, it's very, very important as providers that you come in with the solution. I think where it's extra important as well is talking about non-levy provision, especially in the level 4 to 7 area. There's a lot of cold spots naturally for non-levy. In London, there's only 2 universities that's got a non-levy contract. So actually, it's quite important that as providers we look quite creatively with employers to see how they can utilise that 10%.
Mary, have you used?
So we've got about 10,000 learners on programme across a number of thousands of employers, and we've got 2 employers that are utilising it at the moment. But that said, it's something that employers called for, right? And it's new, and this flexibility that's been brought in, I can absolutely see that a number of our larger technical clients who have got big channel partner networks, for example, are chomping at the bit to be able to leverage it in that way. So I think it was called for by employers to make it more flexible, and government have responded to that. I think that's a positive thing. I do think some of the administrative burden with the most recent round has gotten a bit easier as well. They've listened to a bit around that. I think, again, it'll be interesting one to watch over the coming. The fact that we've got more flexibility on how to spend it is a good thing.
And I think we are probably going to be talking about this, but there's certainly the view that in the most recent announcements from government around non-levy management and contracts, the recognition that training providers can actually help employers through the system. Whereas when we first started, it was very much an issue of employers have to drive it, employers have to do everything. So perhaps there's a bit of a sign that that might be changing. Julie Jenkins has asked a question from Learning for Excellence.
So I think this question leads in really from just what you've been speaking about. So with a number of the providers that are actually struggling financially, does the ESFA contract and process need to be changed or simplified? Do you have any suggestions on how that needs to move forward?
Thank you. Mary, do you have a view? You must be involved in this day in, day out.
So I had quite a sobering conversation as a result, actually, of these funding band reviews that are going on at the moment. I spoke to 5 CEOs and MDs of competitor organisations to mine, and it was sobering and kind of a bit of a sense of relief, because actually, there is struggles going on within our sector, and it's tough. I've only recently changed roles. I used to head up the product development function within QA, so I was responsible for developing and designing these programmes, and a lot of heart, energy and soul has gone into developing them, and changes makes it challenging. I think the one thing I would say to add a bit of balance to this is that if I have my commercial director sat on here and our compliance director, I know that they would say that the contracting is really complicated and really over the top, and it's very difficult. I guess my perspective on this is that we are using taxpayers' money, we are government funded, we're using funds to be able to deliver our programmes. It's important that there is a robust way of managing that we are being held to account to manage those funds sensibly. I think that can sometimes get over bureaucratic, and I think that timeframes that get introduced around changes can be extremely difficult to manage and very administratively costly, and that is at a risk of killing smaller providers. And when we are investing so much in developing new programmes, and we are investing heavily in working with government on these new standards, to have another layer of complexity around that is something that can be a struggle.
One of the drivers of all of the changes was simplicity, but I look for it at all times and I can't see a lot of simplicity. Gordon, you must have locally, certainly, different providers who haven't got a contract. Do you think it's a barrier? Is it something we should look at?
Well, I think it's possibly too early to tell, but I think there are frustrating systemic signs, and I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples of that. I have always firmly believed that, not least because, again, my constituency, I've got large numbers of small and medium, really small enterprises. I've always believed that SMEs can and should play a crucial part in this process. So anything that makes the whole thing more complicated and difficult, I think is going to be a drag on that. I think there's a couple of, again, I'm sorry to have to go back to, it's not so much process, it's structure. I think there are 2 things, and this relates to other aspects of what's going on, which I referred to earlier, which is the slowness of things moving from frameworks to standards. I think there are 2 things that have happened, basically, or rather not happened. But one of them is one thing that has happened, one of them is one that hasn't happened. The thing that has happened is that, and you really have to go back to about 3 or 4 years ago, when, of course, this whole area was not being handled by the Department for Education, but by the then BIS. Now, BIS at the time was subjected, as most departments were, the Department for Education wasn't, to a continuing cuts programme. And part of that cuts programme basically hollowed out, I hope is not too dramatic a way of putting it, much of the expertise and significant expertise of middle-ranking staff in ESFA and in places like BIS. If I think about BIS Sheffield, which was closed, a whole raft of people, probably in their late 40s, early 50s, left and are now hopefully pursuing slightly more lucrative careers, consulting on the things which they previously administered. But that's just one example. My information comes from the interface I have with a range of employers, with sector members and all the rest of it. And what comes across to me is that they're not saying that people in ESFA are useless. And they're not saying that they're not passionate or that people in DFE. What they are saying is that they are coming to this with very relatively poor knowledge and know-how, if I can put it that way, of the industry. And that is, and I'm not going to quote examples that have been given to me by name, but, extreme frustration by one of our largest motor manufacturers in the West Midlands about, this whole process and so on and so forth. So I think that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that, how can I put it? And I know Jerry Bevergood is very keen to, to try and establish some clarity in this. We've got a slightly, from the outside point of view, we've got a slightly hokey-cokey view of, and shake it all about, of what actually the relationship is between DFE, ESFA, and the new institute. Now, if you introduce, changes and rafts of things, you would expect to have problems with bedding down. But the lack of clarity in those areas, and in some areas the lack of resource, and certainly resource of experienced people, I think is being very damaging to the process and very damaging to the enthusiasm of employers to partake in it.
And I don't see too many faces disagreeing with you. I mean, the fundamental changes of the structure must take some time to bed down. So that's not been. So I think you raise a really important point. Kirsty, you deal with both employers directly and through providers. What's your view of the system?
Yeah, I mean, very much echoing really what Mary was saying. I mean, I think that my view of this is that, let's be honest, contracting processes should be robust. They're not there to be simple in that sense, but they shouldn't be confusing. And I think the point Gordon's just been making, I think the problem is we've lost some of the relevant DNA from all of that expertise, and all of those chops and changes is what's made it confusing. But we should have a robust system. But unfortunately, there's always casualties of that, because, of course, what you then do is you lose specialist provision. So, let's be honest, the latest system was there as a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It was there to try and weed out some of the providers, and quite frankly, probably there was some need to do that. But the problem there is, in doing that, we've also lost some really good specialist provision. And my fear, as Gordon just said, is we're going to see that time and time again, as the IFA TE, and we start to think about T levels and the whole process around that. And so I think some of this is about stabilising where the decisions are made and the expertise that is held at Whitehall and in the centre, and letting some of that decision making be a little bit more devolved, so that local decisions, a bit more trust I think we need in this ecosystem. We need a bit more trust and belief that we're all there to do the right thing. We all care about the brand of apprenticeships. We all want to overtrain and give as many opportunities. So I think we need to help our colleagues in ESFA and DFE and IFA just have a little bit more trust in that ecosystem. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that the contracting process was deliberately designed to flush some of this out, and none of us want to go back to train to gain, or even earlier, any of us who live through our individual learning accounts. So there are some war wounds that people still have them in their memory.
And we're not finished yet. We may have a refresh of the ROAP, the register. We've got the non-levy to cope with. So these are big decisions that are being made in real time, which is another one of those reasons why today's debate was important. Is there an employer's perspective? You were saying before you deal with quite a number of training providers. Has anything in the system stopped you getting on with stuff?
No, I don't think so. So we do work with a number of different training providers, and I guess where it gets more complex is when you then want to expand the number, and obviously that's got the admin overhead on ourselves. So we are looking to go down a more managed service provision route, certainly as we're looking at taking on some more niche training providers, and also as we circumnavigate around the devolved nations and tapping into some of the universities in Scotland who get their funding direct from SDS. There is no way that we can have a direct relationship with all the different providers that we do want to utilise. So going down a managed service provision is absolutely the right route for us. And I think it is just making sure that employers know where to go when they're looking for a training provider. And also they know the history of that training provider, the background, and so they know who they then want to engage with.
Yeah, I think one of the themes that has come from almost all the responses is that particularly employers struggle with the constant change. And I've been involved in probably too many apprenticeship reforms. But in all cases, employers say the less change, the better. And of course, everybody puts forward their set of changes and say, yeah, we shouldn't have any more change until after we've changed it just like I want it. So there is a dichotomy there. We all know there's some changes that would be good to make. But at some point, you sort of got to draw a line and say, let's get on and make the system work. I'm not saying that's the point we've reached, because there's still some major things to come. But it does lead to question 4, which I think is from Dan Miller from Young Professionals.
What more needs to be done in order to ensure that providers and subcontractor relationships do not fall foul of Ofsted and ESFA requirements?
Okay, so again, this has been hinted at in a couple of the questions. You deal with a number of different employers. Some of them might end up as subcontractors, but we know that Ofsted and ESFA have been a bit anti-subcontracting. What's your view from a QA perspective, Mary?
Subcontracting, it can be messy. I think that we don't subcontract with very many other providers. Quality is so important to us, just as it is to Ofsted. I thought the wording was interesting, like fall foul of Ofsted and ESFA. I think as a provider that's really passionate about maintaining its Ofsted rating and delivering a quality experience, it's really important that we pick providers that we know share our vision, and sometimes they're not there to do that with, so therefore that can make subcontracting quite tricky when it starts affecting things like the Ofsted ratings and things like that. So it makes us very reluctant to do it, despite the fact that actually employers are really pushing us to do it. They want us to do that more. So we are doing it on occasion with certain employers, so I said we're not subcontracting, but we're having to put a lot of time and energy into making sure it works correctly. So that is administratively heavy again. So we've got quite a big subcontracting team just for the number of contracts that we are working on. And that in itself is expensive as well. So I think we'll start seeing it a bit more. But yeah, I think making sure that the rigor is there, so that the burden again is coming to providers to make sure that we are only subcontracting with people that share that vision.
Alison, do you use subcontracting as your view, particularly at the degree apprenticeship level? Do you see that as got a role or a place?
I think with subcontracting, you can see some absolutely brilliant models. As a university, we actually started off as a subcontractor. That was how we started our apprenticeship journey. And I think that was a good way of doing it, because we had a prime that knew the sector very well, that needed a degree provider, and actually was a good prime in the sense that they supported us on that journey. Subcontracting at its worst can be really, really poor quality. We still know that there are issues around management fees, smaller providers who are hurting enough as it is, waiting for providers to pay them for work. We know that is an issue. So, as I say, at its best, it can be brilliant, and it can actually lead to a lot of innovative delivery models, both with employers. Certainly around HE and FE, you're seeing some really great stuff going on. But I am pleased that they are tightening up on management fees. I am pleased that Ofsted are being more rigorous, and the ESFA around understanding subcontract agreements, because there have been problems in the past and they do need to be addressed.
Just picking up that theme, there's obviously not a great drive to make the subcontracting rules more flexible. So I guess people are saying those controls that have been brought in are probably working now. I still think some of the volume problems that we've had is that it takes a bit of a time for the prime provider to move that volume and work with the employers, because most of that contact was done by the subcontracting. So it has created an issue, but it seems like people do believe that those additional controls were right. Sam Taylor from the Assessors Guild.
As we know, there's various pots of funding available. We have the levy, AB, ESF, Does the panel think that there is something to do, something that can be done to bring it all together? And if so, how could that work?
So I think, and it's certainly something, Gordon, you alluded to. The levy funding has been, I guess, very positive, but it is quite specific. Do you think there should be a wider skills fund? Or how would that work? You obviously think that you could broaden the levy fund out a bit, but what's your view about all of the government funds? Should there be one fund?
Well, of course, it's easy to say one thing in opposition, and probably rather more difficult to say the same thing when you're sitting in a ministerial chair. But the serious point is, it is this eternal conflict between wanting to understand that the skills market is a highly complex area, and therefore you do need to have different funding streams, but at the same time also realizing that it's a very malleable and a very fast-moving area, but at the same time not wanting to have too much micromanagement with the administration comes along with that. I do think it is genuinely a very, very difficult balance to make. I'm going to just not duck the question, but answer it a little bit sideways, because actually one of those funding streams that you mentioned, I think you mentioned ESF, didn't you? Yes, well, what's going to happen to ESF? I mean, we've been promised by the government this rather sort of, I can't even remember what it's called. It's a fairly Orwellian name, like Fund of National Prosperity or something, but we haven't seen any. This is of course, is supposed to replace the funding post-Brexit, which is coming through, and of course which has a really big impact both in the FE area, but also actually in the HE area. I mean, a lot of post-92 universities are very concerned about that. I'm not going to go off on a Brexit theme, but I'm just saying that that is an illustration of how funding changes and how it moves. The other thing, of course, is the nature of skills themselves. I mean, perhaps just to turn the question around, the nature of the skills themselves are changing very rapidly and very radically. This is one of the things in our, as you probably know, slight plug coming up here, the Labour Party has embarked on this process of setting up a national education service. And one of the things that we have said in that process and the charter that has come forward is that we really have to look very carefully at structures that will last into the 2030s. And the nature of skills at the moment, it seems to me, talking to other people, is quite paradoxical, because on the one hand, more and more employers, and certainly surveys are bearing this out, more and more employers are wanting generic skills. I'm not going to call them soft skills. I don't like calling them soft skills because I think that sometimes devalues them. But they're nevertheless, and this applies in apprenticeships as well as other skills qualifications. So they're wanting more and more of that because they know that they're going to train and want to retain, if they can. People may move on. People whose abilities they will need to use in different circumstances if they want over a 5 or 10 year period. And that, of course, goes for the individuals themselves who may not want to stay with the same employer for more than 5 or 10 years. So you've got that on the one hand. At the same time, you've got a situation where, because of the rapid movement in technology and automation and a whole range of other things in particular areas, more and more short-term bespoke skills to deal with technical developments, with the jobs that people do or with the training that they're doing, are coming on board. So we've got this paradox. If you're looking at it from a governmental point of view or even from a devolved administration point of view, we've got to put money into thinking quite hard about generic skills, but we've also got to address some of the short-term issues in terms of that. We believe that can only be done by having a much broader overall framework of structure for funding, which we would do under our National Education Service, that would enable that money to follow the needs that are coming along. Now, how that would impact on the sort of variety of things that you've been talking about, adult skills funding and ESFA, is something we would work out in government. But I am very confident and sure that what is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in the skills market will radically alter the view of what sort of skills that we need, and that will have implications for the funding structures.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks very much. Graham, you presumably deliver quite a number of these different... How did...
24 years into FE, I've seen, I think, as many funding streams as there has been. But the same thing always applies. Is it an eligible learner on an eligible programme? And if you look at all the funding streams that have been in existence since I've been in FE, the same principles apply. The problem is the bureaucracy associated with demonstrating you have an eligible learner and demonstrating they're on an eligible programme is too great. So it's not really about how many funding streams there are, but the bureaucracy associated with drawing down the money to be able to sustain yourself as a provider business delivering these programs. So I worry less about the different ranges, but more about the money I have to spend in being able to meet the needs of these funding streams. So yes, in a utopia world, wouldn't it be nice to have one stream? But actually the sources of this funding are different. Europe, employers, so no one's going to allow, I don't believe anyone's going to allow that to happen. It'd be too complicated. But I just want the bureaucracy associated with that to come down. And actually, greater trust in the system.
Well, I think the word trust has been used a couple of times now. Is it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, these years, when I was in AELP as chief exec, we tried to introduce a trust regime, one that depended on the professionalism of the training provider to integrate the various programs. It was perhaps an ideal before its time, but genuinely I think we haven't got quite the balance. So there's now controls over literally everything, and perhaps shifting the balance. You deal with all sorts of different funding regimes.
I don't know if you remember, actually, Stuart, I came to a ALP dinner about a year ago, and I think one of the topics I talked about then, and only got a lukewarm response at the time, was should it be...
I did tell you.
You did? I was being brave maybe or stupid at the time, but I did say, should we be talking about a skills levy? And I suppose it's interesting, isn't it? That was my view, probably not that considered at that moment in time, because I suppose rather naively I was trying to think, how can we find a way to unlock some of the things we've been talking about? And I still believe a skills levy, as long as it's not at the cost of the apprenticeship system, would have some merit. And I think about all the things that you as employers have to think about, the administration burden, the mentors that we might want, the careers advisors, the work experience coming in from T-levels. If we were really sensible at how we segmented some of this money and we had trust in the system and the ecosystem was allowed to flow around it, we might get some really sensible joined up valued funding streams working together. And my very last point on why I think is, we've mentioned about the fact, let's not go back to the Treasury. It goes to the Treasury, we'll never see it again. So if this is our opportunity of getting hold of it and getting the system to work with it in a meaningful way to get real change to happen, look, I think it should be a skills levy.
Yeah, the day the Treasury get the money back will be the day that, you can imagine the pressure that they will, we gave you the money and you didn't even spend that. So it's a serious point. It's a serious point, and we can't let that happen, and I trust that all training providers will be out there making sure that employers spend their money effectively. I'm really conscious of time, and it need to give you just a small bit of time to ask any questions that you may have of the panel. I hope we've covered the set questions well enough. There's a questioner down there.
Hi, John McDonough from RecRaw Consulting, which is an employability and recruitment solutions business. For many years, there's been an acknowledgement by employers and providers, often privately, of the need to have some really effective psychological work done prior to skills training and not just a tick box exercise. In theory, this should be DWP funded for the unemployed, but effectiveness in this area is very, very varied. There's rarely enough money in skills budgets to do it well, and I've often found that the people who set the essay question, i.e. the specification on this stuff, can't answer it, which we heard in the last debate as well. For this to change, am I right in thinking that we are waiting for a sudden enlightenment in Whitehall policy and commercial departments to either enable or genuinely lead and incentivise the market to deliver what employers and many unemployed people need? And if so, how do we make that happen?
Well, I think it might also come back to different funding streams, and do the different funding streams follow on? I don't know if anybody you must deliver. Do you tend to have, programs for the unemployed that lead to an apprenticeship, or do you tend to manage them as, that's not a leading question, but...
We educate about 2,000 unemployed people a year across our coastal districts. The challenge is what is eligible for funding. It comes back to being almost forced to give a certain offer, because that's what the DWP want, because it believes it brings them positive outcomes. Broadly, we want to deliver an offer that's right for the people, that then gets them job sustainability. There's the short-term versus the long-term problem, which is, yes, we can get someone into a job for the short term, but does that give them a sustainable career? And that, for me, is the major challenge. I've not come across a DWP yet that would favour a longer programme that got someone a real technical skill versus a short, sharp CV building, literacy and numeracy refresh bit of IT that gets them into a short-term job that gets a certain tick. So I think in terms of the way it should go forward, there has to be the freedom to work to bring about local prosperity in an economic region. The devolvement issue, I think, is really, really important, because if all the partners in that area are working to bring prosperity to that region, then they will think about it more for the longer term. The problem with skills policy is it's so short term. And it's about hitting short-term targets for short-term gain. We'll only know over time whether those short-term gains actually bring real-life changes. My fear, unfortunately, as I said, having been here a long time, is it doesn't. And there needs to be a longer-term investment in people who want and require sustainable employment. So I think it's a massive challenge.
Thanks for that. There's a question in the second row.
Just going back to social inclusion and social mobility, we were talking about, it's both a suggestion and a question about budgets as a whole and the 10% handing over. If it was a devolved budget, you could defer that money into, say, organisations that were interested in social mobility's needs, that were involved in these situations. How and when can that happen to be able to devolve those budgets and that 10% into those organisations, perhaps those who have, autistic societies, dyslexic societies, organisations that are within the local communities, such as mine, as Lambeth? We have various initiatives that are trying to kick off in SMEs and local situations. How can we devolve that budget into those situations?
The 10% transfer, lots of organisations, because it started with supply chain, I think people have missed the fact that you can transfer it to all sorts of organisations. I just wonder, someone like Lloyds Bank, would you see that it might be a possible use of the funds to transfer it to organisations that have more of a social purpose as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when we look to decide who we are going to transfer it to, we'll probably go down that route, perhaps more than our supply chain. So we are looking at charities that we're working with to see, how we can share that money. Absolutely.
So I do think it'll be something that does happen.
I mean, I think you've made a really important point that I generally don't think that's understood enough yet. And I think, again, that's exactly where the government could be more, in a way, more helpfully interfering in terms of the website, in terms of the promotion around that, because I think there are lots of things that are actually quite good now that people haven't properly understood. And it's back to your point about the providers, how providers can really pick that up and work with employers to help unlock that.
I think it's a very important, the very important point that you've raised. And again, it goes back, I think, to what members of Parliament and other people who are decision makers in local areas see in their own territory. I still don't think, and I'm not blaming directly the government for this, although I think it was an indirect way, impact of the way in which they consolidated when they were outsourcing all sorts of activities into 4 or 5 big providers in the areas, the Sercos and everybody else that we know of. And of course, we were all promised at the time, well, they will, no, they will, and I was worried in my area because I had 2 or 3 very small training providers who were very niche specific. They were niche specific for people with autism and things like that. And of course, most of those people never got a sniff. And so I think that was a loss. And I think we still underestimate, I say we, decision makers, policy makers nationally, we still underestimate the contribution that the third sector could make in these sorts of areas. The other thing I think which sort of links to that and also goes back a little bit to the previous question as well is I've talked about and we've all talked about the dynamics of change and all the rest of everything and how people are going to have to juggle all these jobs and do this, that and the other. We mustn't neglect the human element of this. People are not robots just to be fitted into these areas. The changes that you have to make, the flexibilities you have to make, cause tension, they cause stress, and there are great things about the digital world, but the ability of, dare I say, some, and particularly I think younger people who are very much of the digital world, to have some of that face-to-face encounter, some of that personal training and everything that goes with it. If we don't get that right, then all these other challenges will fall by the wayside because we won't get people developing in the way that they need to do and improving their skills. It won't be good for their life chances, but it also won't be good for our productivity.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And one big question that has been asked is around the recent sort of view that the IFA are reviewing rates, and the likelihood is a number of, we've only been going a year or 2, and already the rates might be changing. Again, the principle of change, but the principle of whether funding rates might reduce quality, for example, just a very brief, and you can see the time, just to go around the panel, what's your view?
Well, in a very nutshell, I think, of course, if you drop funding, it's going to have an impact on quality. And there's nothing